As GDP is so central to understanding macroeconomics and the basics of studying macro, we want to also be a little bit critical here and understand some of the shortcomings of GDP so that we have an honest assessment of what we're doing when we study macroeconomics. So in this video, we're going to give a list of 8 shortcomings of GDP. And then we're going to try and explain, well, with all these shortcomings, why do we use it and what is it for anyway? The first criticism is this idea of non-market production. If you're working on your own, consumption isn't counted in GDP. If you say, make your own food for dinner, that's not a part of GDP. It's not a part of market production. But if instead you hire somebody to make food for you, that is counted towards GDP. Now the same thing is getting produced either way, a meal. And yet because you're not paying for it on the market, it doesn't count towards production, right? So it's too hard to put these values onto these services, and so we don't add them into the calculations of GDP. So childcare, cooking, yard work, home construction, all of these go uncounted if you don't hire them out. Yet if we pay for these services, they are counted. So here we have a picture of a table in the middle of a living room. And now this table, it could have been purchased from a store, but it wasn't. Made it with my own hands. Since I made it with my own hands and I only used the cost of lumber and some nails and a few other things, maybe it cost like $50. But if we were to buy this table at a furniture store, this table would cost about $500. And so GDP only went up $50, whereas the table is probably worth around $500. We get $500 worth of production. And so GDP doesn't do a good job of handling non-market production because how do you calculate it in? So as was stated, childcare, cooking, yard work, home construction, all these different kinds of things, if you don't pay somebody else to do it, if it's not a market transaction, it's not going to count. Black market transactions are transactions that do take place in a market. However, it's an unofficial market. These are unreported transactions that don't get counted. So you can think of, generally speaking, illegal activities. So even the market for drugs in this case, right? That is a black market transaction. That's a large part of our economy, unfortunately, right? Or think of evading taxes or making kind of a deal where you sell something on a site where you don't necessarily always report it as a part of income or an exchange like eBay or something like that. Maybe you have just a garage sale. That could be a black market transaction where it's not an officially reported market transaction. So GDP doesn't bring into consideration black market transactions where you have made something new. Now, in the case of a garage sale, a lot of times we are just kind of rearranging old production. So that's a good thing. But if you were to make something new and sell it at a garage sale, that should get counted towards our production. So if you were going to say have your little kids have a lemonade stand or sell some cookies there, right? That really technically actually is a black market transaction at that garage sale. And we would want it to count towards GDP, but it doesn't get counted towards GDP because we have no real way of calculating that. Up next is the idea of harmful side effects. GDP makes no allowance for negative externalities such as pollution. So the economic cost to society from air and water pollution are not subtracted from GDP. So we could say, oh, well, we're producing a whole bunch this year, but we're also producing a ton of very harmful pollution. It looks as though our economy is doing a great job because GDP is soaring, right? Whereas, in fact, our economy is really starting to struggle, or at least our society is, because we are creating so much pollution that it could be just this really problematic thing for us. And in fact, to make this even worse, money spent to clean up pollution is actually added to GDP. We are producing something new. We're producing something to clean up that pollution. And so GDP doesn't do a very good job of dealing with harmful side effects or this idea of externalities. Another criticism of GDP here is that we don't kind of factor in the benefits of leisure. So if we have increases in leisure time, this does not get counted towards GDP. So if I am struggling to get by and have to constantly work and produce and be an entrepreneur or whatever it is that I do, I'm always adding towards GDP. But if I've become quite wealthy and I decide to try and live a little bit better of a life and have more balance, I produce some, but then I also take some leisure time. I relax or stay home, right? This is not counted as value created at all when we factor in how GDP is calculated, right? So if we go on vacation and we pay for that vacation, sure, that will be goods and services produced. But if we just kind of take it easier, or we have some more leisure, we have a little bit higher value to our time in terms of work and then life balance, where we just take it easy. This is a benefit, we often think, to how our economy is doing, and yet it would be seen as not increasing the numbers for GDP. So if we're using GDP as this kind of measuring tape here, it's not going to factor in these benefits of leisure, right? Do we value the ability to do nothing, to not go outside today, to stay and sleep and rest and kind of feel more balanced? Sure we do, and GDP is not picking up on that value. The next criticism is this idea that GDP also doesn't pick up on human costs. So it's very similar to the leisure costs here, but now we're looking at the cost of actually producing. The decrease in human costs, such as how strenuous work is, these things aren't necessarily counted. And so here on this slide, we have two pictures, and they're both coal mining. Right? In the picture on the left, it is very, very dangerous. The conditions are not very good. You're in a very, very small, not very well ventilated area, and you're in there for hours and hours and hours on end, and it's probably doing harm to the longevity of your lifespan. On the right, this is more modern coal mining. There's only a few people in there. It's much more ventilated. People have access to better things in terms of time off and kind of making sure that their health is okay. It's a little bit less, cloudy and black and all of this stuff. The hours are different, right? We're not factoring in the strenuous nature of the work. We're just counting, well, how much got produced, right? I would much rather produce a whole bunch of material with less strenuous work than produce a whole bunch of material with, really, really strenuous and hard work, right? And we're not factoring in the cost of the work, the human cost of actually doing these things, right? This leads to GDP being a little bit less accurate measure of economic well-being. Well-being is what GDP to some extent measures, how much we're producing during a year. We're using that as kind of a yardstick for, well, are we doing well within the economy, right? And so GDP is often associated with this idea of well-being, and yet here we can see that it's going to have some shortcomings when it comes to considering the idea of human costs. The next shortcoming is this idea of quality variation. We often use price indexes like CPI or the GDP deflator, and we have to compare a similar bundle of goods across time. So we want to take that same bundle of goods and in 1 year, and then take that same bundle of goods, 15 years later, and say, well, what's the price differences there? And then we can kind of calculate, okay, what are the differences in our total GDP, because now we've adjusted for inflation and all these other things. Well, part of the problem is we have massive quality variation when we do these things. The world's production is constantly changing, and these changes in quality are hard to measure. How do you compare new goods to old goods, right? And so here we have pictured, an iPhone versus an old Walkman. Well, we can think of them as really serving the same function. They're really kind of like the same thing in terms of the Walkman. What was it used for? To have some entertainment in the form of music played, so that you could carry it around and things like that. Well, is that really the same thing as an iPhone? No, it's not even close. But how do we take the same bundle of goods if we wanted to go back into the 1980s and say, yeah, I used to buy a Walkman? How do I take that same bundle of goods into modern time period without having the qualities be variable here? Even things as simple as like tires on cars have had tremendous increases in quality through time. How do you judge one tire versus another in terms of how much of the change in price is due to inflation and how much of it is due to quality variation? Very similar to this is this idea of new technology, right? When we look at new technology, we have to say, okay, well, how does the market handle the introduction of a new mode of transportation or something like that? So if all of a sudden we had the Star Trek technology where we could get beamed up to other places and we no longer needed automobiles, how does GDP handle this, right? Well, there's a new product bias when it comes to GDP. New products are not introduced into the index until they become commonplace. So the dramatic price decrease that is often associated with new technology does not get reflected into the index at all, right? It's not until that good is actually very, very commonplace that we even factor it in at all. So what do you do when you're comparing, a market bundle of goods from yesterday to a market bundle of goods today, but today you have totally new products, right? Often what happens is you wait until that product is really commonplace, and then you compare, this bundle of goods to future bundles of goods. But at that point in time, the price of that new product has already dropped. And so comparing prices and inflation and all of these things starts to get really kind of skewed, really kind of biased in this area. And finally, we have this idea of substitution bias. And along with the past two biases, quality bias and new product bias, these tend to have CPI overstate inflation. So what is substitution bias and how do these things overstate the inflation rates? When the price of a product in a consumer basket increases substantially, consumers will tend to substitute towards lower priced alternatives. So imagine a scenario where there's a big freeze in Florida and the price of oranges skyrocket. You look at yesterday's bundle of goods, you used to get 10 oranges within a year. This year, there's this big freeze in Florida and the price of oranges jump way up. We have to use that same bundle of goods where we're purchasing 10 oranges still. But do people still purchase 10 oranges? No, the prices are really high. They substitute away from oranges and buy Texas grapefruits instead of Florida oranges or things like that. But since the CPI is a fixed weight price index, it's not going to accurately predict the impact of the price increase on the consumer's budget. It's going to act as though the consumer is still buying 10 oranges and 10 really expensive oranges. So that's going to make it seem as though there has been a lot of inflation, when in reality, that's not really the case. There was just inflation in that one product. But we're not going to see that happen in our kind of measures as we go through because we don't substitute away towards the cheaper goods, the goods that didn't have inflation. Right? This is similar with quality bias and the new product bias. With quality bias, over time, the technological advances increase the life and usefulness of products, right? So if we increase the usefulness and the quality of car tires compared to yesterday or past decades, right? We're going to see that there is a decreased tire cost on a per mile basis, but the CPI isn't going to reflect these improvements. It's going to act as though, oh, this is the same quality tire as there used to be, right? And now we're just paying more for it. When in reality, we're not actually paying more for it. We're paying a little bit more for a little bit nicer tire, right? And so it's kind of hard to factor in, right? And the same thing, we overstate inflation with the new product because we don't have the new product as part of our index until it has already become commonplace and already is cheap. So we never see those prices reduced. When something new is introduced, it's usually really expensive, but then the prices go way down. Well, only once the prices go way down are they a part of our index, and then we add them into our indexes and start to see, well, what's happening with prices. So we only get the kind of consistent, oh, well, there's some inflation, once prices drop. We don't consider the reduced price kind of movement that happens originally. And so we have a lot of problems with GDP, a lot of potential conflicts here with how we measure GDP. In these last couple, we see that we're overstating inflation with the way that we use price indexes. So that substitution bias along with the quality and new product bias, these can be real problems that tend to cause CPI to overstate inflation. And what happens then is this makes former levels of real output seem not as far behind the current levels of output. It makes it seem as though, oh, well, times weren't so bad back in the day. Sure, maybe the GDP is showing that we are a little bit better off than we were, but it's not really that much of a difference. When we overstate inflation, we're overselling that story. Turns out, if we take this criticism seriously, we are a lot better off than we used to be because the price indexes have overstated the inflation that has occurred. So we have to be really careful with all of these criticisms of GDP to use it appropriately and not abuse it to try and do things that it was never meant to do in the first place. So why do we use GDP? Why GDP? Why? Why do we do this? Given all of these shortcomings, GDP is trying to be a measuring rod, but we're saying, oh man, it really has some faults in using it this way. Why do economists and news media place so much emphasis on GDP then? Well, in spite of its shortcomings, the evidence indicates that real GDP per person is a broad indicator of living standards, and it does a pretty good job at this. As real per capita GDP in the United States has increased through time, the quality of most goods has increased, while the amount of work time required for their purchase has declined. Similarly, as real per capita GDP has risen in the United States and other countries, life expectancy and leisure time have increased. Literacy rates have gone up. Infant mortality rates have gone down. The great contribution of GDP is its ability to measure short-term fluctuations in output. Year-to-year and quarter-to-quarter changes in real GDP provide a reasonably precise, though certainly not perfect, we have plenty of flaws that we have brought up here, but a reasonably precise measure of what is happening to the rate of output. If we try to measure GDP across long time periods and say, how were things in 1920 versus 2020? Then we start to get really kind of messy with these criticisms of GDP. But the short-term fluctuations, that's the real great contribution of GDP. So we can try to measure what's happening in the economy from year to year and quarter to quarter. All right, so this has been the shortcomings of GDP. To continue on in this lecture series in macroeconomics, click the video link here.